So now let's go into changing scenes. That's really our goal here. So what we're going to do is to change scenes within Unity. And the reason, let me, I guess, give motivation for why we want to change scenes. We want to change scenes because when we have our title screen, we want our title screen to be completely separate from our actual world. So when we press Start Game, it's actually going to switch between scenes. So it might jump from World 1 to Forest World. Or in this case, it will jump from title screen to Forest World. To do this in Unity, we actually need to write a script that handles it. So we're going to have to start jumping into some code here. So if we go into your scripts folder and create a new script, we can go ahead and create a C# script. And I'm going to call it Scene Switcher. And once you've done that, you can double click on it and Mono Developer Visual Studio will start to open up. For me, it was Mono Develop. Perfect. And you should have a scene switcher here. So the way we're actually going to structure a scene switcher is what we want to do is we want scene switcher to be used by other C# scripts. So scene switcher is just in charge of switching scenes, and that's all. And then other scripts can get access to them and call the functionality. So to do this, we need to expose stuff to other scripts. So similar to how we exposed variables, where we'd say something like public float speed, or something along the lines of that, where you can see it in the Unity editor. In this case, we're going to type in public void switch scene. And then do string scene name. And you can see that this is very similar to how things like onTriggerEnter were structured and start were structured. But now all that we've done is added a public to the front of it. So if we're looking at this, we've sort of glossed over functions in the past. And I'm not sure, is anybody here not familiar with functions? At least a few people. So functions, the main idea with them is that they have a name. So in this case, it's name switch scene. They have input or arguments. So in this case, it's going to take a string, which is sort of just any sort of string of characters. So something like the word hello would be a string because it all gets passed in. That's just sort of the naming convention. And then there's void, which is what it returns. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but in this case, void means that it returns nothing. So whenever we call this, nothing is going to happen to the person who called it. Cool. So now what we want to do is go up to the top here and go using Unity Engine dot scene management. So you need to type this in, otherwise you won't have access to the scene management capabilities within Unity. So after you do that, you can go into your switch scene, type in scene manager, and dot load scene scene name. So in this case, what we're doing is we get our scene manager, we call load scene, and on load scene, we pass in scene name. And in this case, scene name was passed into switch scene. So this ends up being a pretty trivial function. It sort of is just a nickname for scene manager.loadScene at this point. But in this case, it actually ends up being necessary for what we're going to be doing. Cool, so we have scene switcher. That's great, and it pretty much should do the job. We can test that. So to test that, there's a few ways. So what we want to do, since we started 10 minutes late today because of the thing, I might go over by like 10 minutes or so. So I might go to like 8:10, just so I can like fit this in because I think this is a pretty important concept. So what I want to do is I want to be able to go into my scene, go create 3D object cube, just plop a cube in there. It got launched into the middle of nowhere. Unity, why are you doing this to me? And then drag it up here. Totally temporary stuff. Just gonna make it a little bit bigger, make it a little bit taller. Something like that. And on this, I'm going to switch the box collider to, actually, I'll keep it as a collision. I'll keep it as a normal one. Cool. So what we want to do in this case is we want to make it so that when the ball hits that block, it switches scenes. So that shouldn't be too tough. We just made a scene switcher. So now we just need to make another script that listens to a ball hitting this wall and then calls the scene switcher function. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go right click, create, make another C# script, and we can call this one scene switch zone, something along the lines of that. Double click. Okay, so up until now, the way I would have handled this usually when explaining to everyone is I would say make the box collider a trigger, and then we're going to use onTriggerEnter, and whenever that's called, we are going to do something to the ball or we're going to do some action. That's great. There's actually, I've been focusing a lot on onTriggerEnter, but there's a lot of different variations of this, and one of a really important one, neither is really more or less important. This one is called onCollisionEnter. So the way this one works is you do void onCollisionEnter, and then instead of passing in a collider, we pass in a collision. I usually do call for this one. You can really call it whatever you like. But on this one, onCollisionEnter is going to be called right when an object hits this collider. So that's a little bit different than a trigger. And I think we can show that pretty easily by just putting a debug log in here. Debug.log collided. Okay, cool. So very basic onCollisionEnter. Let's test that out. Oops, that's not what I want. Let's go back to Unity. Click on our big box here. And let's just go ahead and add scene switch then. Sweet. Does the job. Nothing crazy. Anyway, having difficulty getting to that? No. Cool. So if we press play, I press play without maximizing screen so we can see what's going to happen in the console down here. I can start scooting forward. I can jump up. See a hit player from the other one, and we're looking for collision. So now, whenever I hit the wall, you can see the number of times it's happened. I can uncollapse it. So whenever I hit the wall, another time of collide is going to happen. So this is great because sometimes you want to detect when someone's hit something, but you don't necessarily want it to not block them. Like you might want to detect when someone hits the ground, so you'll use onCollisionEnter for that. Or you might want to detect when the player hits something, so you use onCollisionEnter for that. So I've been focusing on onTriggerEnter a lot because that tends to be how you would approach this from a practical standpoint, but I want to show you guys that onCollisionEnter is also pretty important. And it's actually not the only one in this class of functions. There are two other types. So the two other types, if I go back, are onCollisionStay and onCollisionExit. So the way that enter works is that whenever you hit something, this works for both trigger and collision. Whenever you initially hit something, it's going to call onCollisionEnter. Whenever you are sort of resting on something, so maybe you hit the ground and now you're standing on it, onCollisionStay is going to keep getting called over and over and over again while you're standing on it, so that you can sort of detect how long someone is on something or how long objects are touching each other. And then maybe you have your character jump. Right when your character jumps, that's when onCollisionExit is going to be called. So we have all three events that can be called, and this happens for both collision and trigger. So in trigger, it would be the same. Right when you enter it, onTriggerEnter gets called. while you're inside the trigger, on trigger stay gets called. Right when you exit the trigger, on trigger exit gets called. So in this case, I'm just using on collision enter just to show you guys. We also don't really need access to the collision or the collider, so in this case, it doesn't matter. Collision ends up being a little bit different than collider, so you have to be a bit careful with that. Any questions? Cool. So what we want to do now is I want to be able to put this scene switch zone on an object as well as the scene switcher. And I want the scene switch zone to grab that scene switcher and call something on it. So how do we do that? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a scene switcher variable, call it switcher, or whatever you like. Except for switch, don't call it switch. That one's actually not allowed. That one is reserved by C#. Everything else you're allowed. So now we're going to go and get access to the switcher. So we've made a switcher variable, but that doesn't mean that we have access to the switcher that's on this object. So what we can do is in void start, you would say switcher equals, as we've done before, get component scene switcher. So in this case, you can see scene switcher is identical, well, not identical, but pretty similar to any other component you have in your object. So for instance, before we would get things like the rigid body, or we get the collider or the animator. In this case, now we're going to do the exact same thing, just with the scene switcher. So we're going to use that, and that's going to allow us to get access to the scene switcher. And if we go down here, we can say switcher, you can press dot, it should, if you sort of scroll down, or if you just type it in, switch scene. Switch scene now exists to us, and we have access to that other function that we just wrote all the way over in this file. So we have scripts communicating with each other. And this ends up being really important as you start building things out, because you really don't want to put all of your functionality inside of one script, because it's just going to start getting really complicated. It's going to start getting really difficult to track down exactly where something goes wrong. So if something breaks in your code, which it inevitably will, it would be much nicer to say, okay, like it's in the scene switch zone script, which is only 20 lines long, versus it's in my game manager script, which is like 2,000 lines long or something crazy. You want to keep it something manageable. So that's why we do this, and that's why we have this seemingly trivial example, because in this case it is, but the concepts behind it are really important. So now we have switch scene, but we need to call it with a string because we put that before. So let's give our scene switch zone a string. Let's just do public string next scene name. And when you do something like this in C#, by default, it's going to fill it in like that for you and sort of just put two quotes next to each other just to say, this is a string that has no characters in it, so it technically says nothing. Cool. And now when we do switch scene, we're just going to call it with next scene name. So we have this now. Let's hop over to our scene. And as we had before, we have our scene switch zone, but now it needs to get access to a scene switcher. So let's add a scene switcher to this object as well. So now you can see that we have both of them on the exact same object. And then we have our next scene name. I'm going to look at my current scenes. Let's see, world 1 was my previous one. So I'm going to type in world 1. And if we do this, it's going to almost work. It's going to be right there. And it can be a frustrating thing if you forget to do this, but the way Unity's scene management works is that Unity has a list of scenes that it actually is going to care about. And you have to add your scenes explicitly to this list. So to do that, we have to go up to File, and then down to Build Settings. And now we can see we have this big Scenes and Build. So there's a very convenient Add Open Scenes. If we click on this, you can see our forest world got added. But I also want to add world 1. So I'm going to go ahead and take it and just drag it in. In this case, it can be above or below. It doesn't really matter for now. But the way that the ordering works is that when you eventually build this game, we haven't really gone over building, but when you build the game, which means it will create an executable that someone can just double click on and your game plays, the first scene it's going to go to is the one that's at the very top. So it's important for the ordering in that sense, and maybe if you have a sequential ordering of your levels, otherwise it shouldn't matter. So now we've added those scenes in the build. I've typed in world 1 to our next scene name. Let's test it out and see if I have any bugs, because sometimes that happens. So I'm going to hop up here, and let's go and hit it. And I am back at my world 1 scene, which admittedly looks much more boring than the other one does now that we're back to it, unfortunately. But I like the snake here more. It does look a little bit better in my mind. And we have these nice animated things that I'm really bad at navigating. So that's how scene switching and communicating between scripts works in a very basic, contrived example. But I think it gives a good example for you guys to start moving forward.